In this section, we're going to discuss two types of memory that, unlike decorative memory, aren't verbally accessible: the memory for skills and the relatively short-term memory for information that's not consciously perceived. The ability to acquire skills is called procedural memory, and often the skills have a significant body movement component, like the appropriate sequences of muscle movements in the tongue, the throat, and the lungs that generate appropriate sounds when speaking. In episodic memory, the memory is acquired immediately, just by experiencing an event. But skills are acquired by often extensive repetition of the muscle movements required. On the other hand, the acquisition of semantic memories also often requires some repetition. We find it very difficult or impossible to describe exactly how we ride a bicycle, or how we produce the sequences of muscle movements required to speak a word. And this disconnect between skills and speech was highlighted by some studies of skilled machine operators who were asked to describe how they performed their skill. It was found that their descriptions were very inaccurate and tended to resemble the instructions they were given when they started learning to operate the machine. And even more interesting was that after generating such verbal descriptions, their actual performance deteriorated. And in general, if we think too much about how we're carrying out a skill, our performance will often suffer. Now, although procedural memory is different from decorative memory, there are some interdependencies. For example, the initial learning of a skill may sometimes involve a lot of decorative learning. To give an example, when we begin to learn a skill like whitewater canoeing, we explicitly learn patterns in the river that are relevant to what actions to take, like the V-shaped flow of relatively smooth water that indicates an appropriate entry point to a rapid. We can talk about what we're learning. But after we become skilled, it becomes a lot less easy to verbalize exactly what sensory inputs trigger different skill behaviors. To quantitatively compare the acquisition of skills between people and identify commonalities, there are various experimental procedures for measuring procedural memory under more controlled conditions in the lab. One of these procedures is observing different subjects learning to perform a task called mirror tracing. In mirror tracing, the objective is to learn to draw a line between the inner and the outer shape, but the shape, the hand, and the pencil are only visible in a mirror, so the visual feedback from a movement is the opposite way round. Initially, a lot of tracing errors are made, but greater accuracy can be acquired through practice. And there's a quantitative measure of skill, the number of times the trace goes outside the guides. This is a relatively pure sensory motor coordination skill, and does not seem to need much decorative learning. And interestingly, amnesiac patients with no ability to acquire new semantic or episodic memories can nevertheless acquire and retain mirror tracing skills. And remarkably, those patients improve with each training session, but have no memory for the earlier sessions. The other lab test of procedural memory that's commonly used is word string identification. But before I discuss it, I'll introduce some older terminology that's often used to describe these types of tests, the terms explicit and implicit memory. The term explicit memory is almost synonymous with decorative memory, but implicit memory includes both procedural memory and priming memory. Historically, the terms were defined as a result of observations that specific brain damage eliminated the ability to perform explicit memory tests, but not implicit memory tests. The tests examine the ability of human subjects to remember and respond to letter strings. In the case of explicit memory, subjects are shown a list of letter strings that are all genuine words. Then, a few days later, they're asked to provide the words on the list, or alternatively, they're shown words and asked if they were on the earlier list. The average number of words a subject can recall is higher for words with related meanings. For example, if nurse and doctor were two of the words, but the total number recalled declines with time. Recognition rate is higher than recall rate and declines a bit more slowly than recall rate as well. In implicit memory testing, subjects are shown letter strings, one after another, some being real words, others are not words, but these non-words are constructed so that they could plausibly be English words. In response to each word, subjects are asked to identify it as a word or a non-word as rapidly as possible, and the time they take is recorded. A few days later, subjects are again tested with sequences of word strings, some from the earlier list, others new. The skill learning is that words and non-words that were on the earlier list are classified somewhat faster than new letter strings. Patients with degraded abilities to create new decorative memories, generally as a result of brain damage, perform badly on the explicit memory test, but on the implicit memory test show the same improvement in reaction times as normal subjects. In the pure form of priming memory, there's some sensory input which the subject was not aware of at the time, but later it has an effect on behavior. A very clean measurement of this effect is tachistoscopic image recognition. In this test, subjects are shown a sequence of images. Each image is seen for a very brief period, less than 100 milliseconds, and then a masking image is shown that eliminates retinal afterimages. And after each image, they're asked to identify the object. It's found that the typical identification accuracy is low, but if exactly the same image has been seen under the same conditions slightly earlier, even though it was not identified at the time, the accuracy for the second presentation almost triples. In another test of priming, subjects are shown a word very briefly, followed by, again, a masking image. They are then shown a letter string and asked to complete it into a full word. Different words are tachistoscopically presented prior to the same letter string. And the word the subject selects to complete the fragment is significantly influenced by the word they were exposed to, even though they couldn't identify that earlier word. So in this fragment completion test, there's some semantic knowledge that must be primed. So the phenomenon is actually called conceptual priming. In the image recognition test, on the other hand, it's pure visual information that's primed. So the phenomenon is called perceptual priming.